Again, good evening and welcome. My name is Igor Marjanovic, and I have a great pleasure to serve as the Dean of the Rice School of Architecture. And it is a special honor tonight to welcome you all to a lecture by our own Danny Samuels, who will be retiring in June after 47 years at the Rice School of Architecture. So please join me with a big round of applause first. I will tell you a few things about Danny's background, although he's the kind of person that needs no introduction. He has many friends, students, current students, past students, colleagues here at Rice, but also many of you in the larger Houston communities who know him all too well. And he's been a wonderful friend and colleague and also mentor to me. So this is a tremendous moment for us to celebrate an incredible impact on the school and the legacy and the kind of mark that Danny left on the school. Danny hails from Paragould, Arkansas, and made his way to Phillips Academy Andover through a scholarship, attesting to his early dedication to pursuing education at the highest and most competitive level. In 1965, he entered Rice University as a first-year architecture student. During preceptorship, he went to Paris, where he worked under Guillermo Julian de la Fuente, a protege of Le Corbusier. The experience was extremely influential for Danny, and he went to Venice with Guillermo Julian for 6 weeks to work on the very iconic Venice Hospital project. Danny received a Bachelor of Architecture degree in 1971, and in 1972, he co-founded Taft Architects with John J. Casbarian, Robert Timme, and Liliana Milani, setting the stage for decades of innovative architectural endeavors. Throughout his tenure at Rice Architecture, Danny's impact has been profound. His dedication to community engagement and outreach efforts has left an indelible mark, exemplified by his partnership with Rick Lowe of Project Row Houses and the work he's done in that particular area. Danny's commitment to teaching and mentorship has touched countless lives. He approaches design thinking across scales and imparts this mode of working to his own students. From 1991 to 2012, Danny taught the first-year studio with Nonya Grenader, which introduced students to architectural principles of design by creating toys. And I just saw Nonya is in the audience today. Nonya, thank you for joining us, and also thank you for everything that you also did for the Rice School of Architecture. In 1996, Danny started the Rice Building Workshop, now known as Construct, where Rice architecture students work on projects across communities in the larger Houston area. Rice Building Workshop designed and built Zero House, which was an entry into the Department of Energy's solar decathlon in Washington, D.C., and also a permanent addition to Houston's Project Row Houses in the 3rd Ward. Currently, as part of Construct, student designs chairs and a variety of materials in the course that Danny taught last fall here in the school. Fellow professor and partner in Taft Architects, John Casbarian, notes that one of Danny's most amazing abilities is to always be on site, physically building and working in the community with the students. And I cannot testify how many times, even in the heat of summer, Danny is covered in sawdust, getting the furniture ready to install in the next AD unit or something like that. In addition to Rice, Danny has also taught at Yale, University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, Clemson, and he has lectured widely. In his personal time, Danny is an avid cyclist, model airplane collector, and a devoted wearer of Vans shoes. Danny, we will miss you, but we know you won't be going very far. We still have some research projects to work on together, and as a sign of our little appreciation, I have a little bit of a gift for you. On behalf of the school, we have a book and a surprise gift that I would like to give it to you. I know it's a dangerous thing to give a book to Danny Samuels, because if you know Danny, he has how many? 7,800 books already, but this one is just fresh out of press, so hopefully you didn't get Album Punjab by Le Corbusier from his trips to India in 1951. It's a phototypical reprint, so we'll give you that too. So please join me in honoring Danny Samuels. We're going to open the gifts now just to make sure that he doesn't indeed have the book.
Now it's going to be a short lecture because you've given so many of them, you've covered so much of what I was going to cover.
It's just a warm-up. I'm sure there is plenty left.
Okay, I don't have this, no.
Okay, it's a win.
Wow. Fantastic.
No, we won't. It's a facsimile edition with his sketches and photographs from a trip to India.
Okay.
Oh, well. And we have something else for you over here. So.
And I should open that as well.
Please do.
Okay.
You might be tempted to wear it.
All of this is because at the end, I'm not going to take any questions. We're just going to adjourn to the reception. Can't get it open.
It's okay. It's coming there in the hand. I can get the ball.
Is this a test?
It is a little bit of a test. So, as Danny said, he will start the lecture in just a minute. We won't be doing any Q&A as soon as we can open this, but after the lecture, we'll all transition in the jury room for a reception. But Danny has a construction hat from the Rice School of Architecture with signatures from all of us. Thank you, Danny.
Okay, let me see if I've got this set up right. Thank you, Igor. And a year and a half ago, I gave a talk at Fondren Library for the Friends of Fondren about the books that shaped my world. And I thought that was a kind of interesting theme that I did not want to repeat tonight, but the idea of the shaping of the world, I think, is a very personal thing, and it's a very universal thing at the same time. So I want to talk about people, places, and experiences that have shaped my world, mostly centered right here at the School of Architecture, but with a lot of tangents, forks, spin-offs, loops, backtracks, and dead ends. So there are a few things I'd like to recap about that talk that I gave that I think are kind of important truths for me anyway. One is, the books that I talked about were picture books, not textbooks. In my world, the image is the prime thing. Text unfolds in a linear way, with some kind of a narrative direction over time. Pictures are immediately comprehensible. So another important aspect is the idea of framing. A book, in a way, frames a view of the world, whether it is in text or pictures, a frame that partitions off a piece of the continuous space and time that's around us. It's a fragment of the universe, a window on the continuum as seen by an observer. This is different than that, here is different than there, and my framing is different than your framing. So just briefly, basically how I ever got here. My great-grandmother, Ida Schmeukes, who lived in the Ukraine area of the Russian Empire. My only known ancestor from that time. Her son, Wolf Schmeikus, on the left. I don't know why these Ukrainian teenagers are dressed as gauchos, but they were. And Wolf comes to the United States, lands in Canada, goes to St. Louis and joins his family in 1916. One among many, many, many Ukrainian youths who left, fortunately, at that time. He found another refugee, Fanny Sorkin, and they got married in St. Louis in 1916, and they started having a family. So that's my grandfather. So did I say he starts as Wolf, he arrives as William Samuels in St. Louis and meets Fanny, and they start the family. I mean, he was the relative that I was closest to growing up. On the left is my father and my aunt, two aunts, and there were two further boys after that. They started a dry goods store in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and family business. This is the 1930s, and they were basically overrun by floods and the Depression, and it just did not go too well. So William bought a business, Samuel's Hide and Metal. Well, it was not that when he bought it, but he bought a scrapyard and started Samuel's Hide and Metal Company. My father on the left and my Uncle Sammy on the right. They came to Paragould, Arkansas, the one and only, according to this mural, the one and only Paragould. And it is because it was named after the crossing of the two railroads that were owned by robber baron Jay Gould and another baron, I don't know if he was a robber, J.W. Paramore, and somebody did a mashup of the two names. So it's a unique name, but it may have the one and only name, but it was actually a fairly common Main Street town of the Mid-South, 8,000 people in the flatlands of Arkansas, not the beautiful hills. But this is where I grew up. So remember this Trice's furniture that you see here. It's going to come back later. So my father, Bernard, well, it was not my father at that time, and enlisted in the Army. He went to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Baltimore and met Barbara Turco, who likewise was a child of immigrants from the same area. And somehow he convinced her to come to the one and only Paragould, where they had me. So this is, I'm sitting on the front porch reading Time magazine, September 13th, 1948, Methodist Bishop Bromley Oxnam on the cover. Less than 2 years old, probably. I read Time magazine for pretty much my whole younger life until I got exasperated with it. It was actually interesting in those days. At home, growing up, we didn't have a whole lot of books. We had this one thing that really got my attention, the Encyclopedia Book of Knowledge, which I think was some kind of subscription encyclopedia with lots of articles in it. And this probably dates back to late 20s, early 30s. It was one that my mother and my uncle had, and it has illustrations in it that just riveted me. For instance, this view of how long it takes to get by train to different celestial bodies. Of course, that was the only way to get there then. And on the side of each, well, first of all, you have these viaducts where the tracks just peel off into the heavens, and on the side of each one is how many is how long it takes to get to different destinations. So the moon, 166 days, Mars, 76 years, nearest star, 40 million years. I pored over this illustration for so long. I just loved it. There were lots of others too. This series on bridges, caissons being sunk down into a river bottom, the building of the Quebec Bridge and the Firth of Forth Bridge. I mean, those just, it's 5 or 6 years old, just really got me. By the way, both of those bridges are disaster relief bridges. They're ones that are replacements for bridges that actually fell down for one reason or another. Which happens, still happens. Or these airships where you see the same kind of structural principles of these articulated trusses, triangulated trusses, to build a large framework to make the shape of something, except that in this case, they had to be super light out of aluminum, not heavy as the Firth of Forth Bridge was, like giant steel members, these lightweight aluminum members, but they kept falling too. These airships, not just the Hindenburg, but lots of them, hit the ground, and mostly from storms. And then there were these images of airplanes that just were an early fascination to me, and I still am. I love airplanes for some reason. I can't tell you exactly why, but there is something about the design environment that these kinds of things develop in, where the constraints are so specific and so rigid, and yet they develop with some kind of aesthetic component to them. And I tried to, when I was a kid, I drew these things. I copied these freehand out of magazines, 3-view drawings, and I did portfolios of these with ballpoint pens, and all of my favorite planes, and they're still my favorite planes, the same ones are. I wanted to make better drawings, and in the 7th or 8th grade, I found this book, Engineering Drawing, by French. And in it was like a key to how to make drawings using, T-squares and triangles and and ink. And I got myself a T-square and a triangle just like that. And I lusted after a drawing instrument set, and I actually had the Theodore Alteneater Company in Philadelphia price this set for me with all of the pieces that I wanted, and it was too expensive. So I got a cheap one from Sears, which did the job, more or less. Recently, though, I found out these things are on eBay, lots of drawing instrument sets, including specifically the one I wanted, and it was about the same price as it was 50 years ago, too. So now I have a whole collection of drawing instrument sets, and they're fascinating tools, but they're tools for making ink lines principally. The tools for making the straight lines are just those 2 ruling pens up at the top. Everything else is for making arcs and circles. And I was able to make this drawing. I mean, this is a big jump for me, to be able to make a drawing of an airplane that's actually, not freehand. And it was a significant turning point for me, because it came to, this is age 14, it came to the attention of Guy Ramsey, the one and only architect and the one and only Paragould. And at age 14, I first walked into his office, and my life changed in an instant. A first fork in the road. Goodbye, aeronautical engineer. Hello, architect. And I never looked back. So Guy had done this house up the street from where I lived, obviously in the Wrightian style. And this is from Google Street View 2 days ago. same house that's in pretty good shape. It did not have a front door there originally, but he took me in. I drew ink grids, 2 feet 8 inch grids in blue ink as base for drawings. And by the way, this is the Harlan Trice house, the guy who has the furniture company on Main Street. Guy was a student of Fay Jones, had been a student at University of Arkansas, and that connected me in a way to Fay, even though it was many years later before I actually met him. I was just seduced by these kind of, I think, of course, he studied with Frank Lloyd Wright, but I think the young Jones actually did late Frank Lloyd Wright better than Wright did. There's something about these houses of this period that are just so, they're Arkansas, but they're just right on. And I should mention that Fay Jones went to graduate school here at Rice in 1951. So these connections just keep happening. So it was much later, 1980, when Jones had the breakthrough design of Thorn Crown Chapel that really shifted the Wrightian paradigm into his own direction in a very significant way. And he was one of the few Wright students who actually transcended the Wrightian style, I think. Guy also had this magazine laying around the office, which was May 1957 architectural design issue on Bruce Goff. And again, I was fascinated with this. This is just Goff's work up, the Oklahoma architect, who's a little bit off the page, I would say, the one and only Bruce Goff. This issue culminates with the Bavinger house, this kind of spiral stone going up with pods hung from the ceiling. That fascinated me, but it wasn't until we got here to Rice, jump forward some years, Bill Bavinger was in our class, and he grew up on pod number 18 on the plan and playroom number 17. So I worked for Guy for years in Paragould and Heber Springs and in Memphis, and I was totally taken by architecture. So here, this is the first architectural sketch that I ever did of a library for Paragould, Greene County, circular building. What can I say? It's kind of laughable now, but I also drafted it up, ink on illustration board, and with color pencil and all, details of the planter and the stair, et cetera, et cetera. So when I went to Andover for 2 years, I continued this kind of parallel study I invented architectural projects for myself, and finally ended up with something that was sort of post-Wrightian, and probably looking at Lou Kahn for this architectural office that I did as a senior, and it was enough to win the art prize at Andover anyway. And I started thinking about, where do I go from here? Everybody in my class was going to Yale, Princeton, and Harvard. After the blizzard of '64, I decided I needed to go someplace much warmer than that. So I don't know if St. Louis is warmer, somewhat warmer. I applied at Washington U, and at the last minute, I got an acceptance from Rice with full tuition. And so another fork in the road where all of a sudden, everything shifts completely in a different direction, unexpected direction. I had never been to Rice. I had never been to Houston. I didn't know really anything about it except that they had an architecture school that was a little bit shaky, but, okay. And so my world was reshaped again. This is what the campus looked like when we got here. And I always think of it as being a lot like it is now, but it was not. I mean, you look at this and it's like completely different. This was an article in Time magazine about Rice, touting the school. It was I mean, nobody knew about this school. Nobody knew about the School of Architecture. It was really off the map, but here we were. And here we were in Anderson Hall. I thank Don Finley for this reconstruction drawing of what it was like. If you can imagine, the second floor of that part of the building over there only was the School of Architecture. Number one, the yellow rectangle, was the studio for first, second, third, fourth year. John, first year too, right? First through fourth year. So there are about 100 students in that one room. The gray area number 6 is actually mathematics offices. That was not ours. We had one room down on the first floor, but basically very small amount of territory. And just to give you an idea, here it is superimposed on the existing building where we are right now. Where we are right now was faculty offices on the second floor and a small assembly room like 118 down here. But we've come a long way since then, and we're going much further. So up in that one room, that studio, we were all in there. And there was no personal stereo in those days. It was like somebody had the music and played the music, and everybody else listened to that music. No other options. And it was kind of raucous and unruly. We're not working on computers. We're working with, materials and ink pens, and it's not like it was. But, the cult of the charrette is the same now as it was then. But what I really liked, what most impressed me about the school was these driveway parties. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you could not drink on campus, but you could drink. In those days, you could drink at age 18 off campus. So every week there was a beer keg party in somebody's driveway off campus with faculty and students. And I thought that was just so great to get drunk with my teachers. Everybody's drinking from these humdinger cups, and that must have been something about it also. But the first teacher here who really, really impressed me and continues to impress me is Eleanor Evans, Miss Evans, who, this was, 1964, 60 some odd years ago, and she was in the third year of teaching first year studio. And very demure, enigmatic person. She didn't tell us very much. She just sort of set up problems to do and with minimal comment, but we all loved her. She studied at Yale with Albers in the 50s, and we all called her Miss Evans. And if my slide stacks actually work, this is a stack of slides of Eleanor at age 100. 50 years later, and this was a few years ago, in her studio, which was 2 apartments in her senior living center, where she really set it up like a studio. She had incredible objects that she had found and that students had given her over the years, just fascinating stuff that we all considered a privilege to be able to go see it as students. We've also, her own work, baskets in this case, we've managed to put a lot of this work into the Woodson Archive, along with a lot of her student work. I'm not showing any student work here. I'm only showing objects or works or basket works that she did. And at age 100, she did this series of leaf montages, and Rice School of Architecture published this book about that body of work. And everybody really ought to take a look at this. Another big influence for us was Paul Kennan. Bill Caudill, the dean at that time, had hired a lot of new people, but Kennan was one of them. He had come from the Saarinen office, and he had two mantras for us. One is, what is your concept? And every concept had to be unique and different, and build a model of it. And here is Aero, I think it is Aero, immersing himself totally into a model of the TWA terminal that Paul worked on. But this is the spirit of it. It's like, get involved with your stuff. And that also tied in with the Saarinen legacy, also tied in with the Eames legacy, because they worked together so much. And it just happened that in 1964, before I came here, I did go to the New York World's Fair, and I saw this IBM pavilion, which was a remarkable experience, collaboration between Saarinen and Eames. It was a canopy held up by steel trees with all this kind of IBM exhibit space on the bottom. But the main thing was this egg elevated up with that diagonal bleachers that would come down, and you would queue up, move into it, and then the bleachers would move up into the egg, where there was this 22 screen presentation. That was a novelty in those days. We had never seen anything like that. You can see the projectors are coming from all over the place. I think there's a YouTube of the presentation, but the Eames office presentation of this is spectacular. And of course, the thing that influenced all of us so much and became a kind of paradigm for the whole culture to understand was Powers of 10, which is a trip through the universe from a guy's hand sitting in a picnic in Chicago, going all the way out to the extremity of the universe, known universe, and then all the way back down through his hand to the very smallest structures that they knew about at that time. The early version of this was the rough sketch of 1966, 68, and then there was a final version, 77. There's something that's just interesting about the early version of this. You've all seen this, haven't you? If you haven't seen it, go to YouTube and take a look at it. Much later, I discovered another connection to Eames, and that is Charles Eames in 1935 had designed a church in the one and only Paragould that I didn't even realize was an Eames work until much, much later. It's only a few blocks from the scrap metal yard, and this was a turning point for Eames. He did 2 churches in Arkansas, and because Eliel Saarinen saw this kind of Nordic romantic style, which he did himself, Eliel, saw this, he invited Charles to come to Cranbrook, where he met Ray Eames, and of course, history ensued. Another important time and person at Rice, I think this was second year, this was 1967, New Schools for New Towns, a design charrette sponsored by the Ford Foundation to look at the effect of computers on the architecture of schools. I mean, there were only mainframe computers in those days. Nobody understood what a personal computer might be, but this design charrette was to look at that. And Will Kennedy, who in his very earliest days at Rice, organized this, and he brought together 6 architects from around the world to be in that room up there, that same studio, for 2 weeks during the summer when Sgt. Pepper's came out. And as I said, no personal music. I mean, if you wanted to listen to Sgt. Pepper, you had a record player, like somebody in the studio did, and you played the record loud and over and over and over again, which was great because, I mean, we were all astounded by this new music. Nothing like what the Beatles had done before. Cedric Price was there. Actually, that guy was on Cedric's team. And then Bob Venturi was there, and I was on Bob's team. This was before Denise. Actually, this was just like right at the cusp of Denise. I'll tell you in a minute. And it was right after, well, his new town was Beltway, Maryland or something, and he wanted to redesign the whole town, which he did, as this kind of ideal suburb. And I built this model of the main street of the town that's 3 feet wide and 14 feet long out of plasticine. And I remember I better go back to that one, the last night of the charrette, Bob, we thought that he had a guest in town. So, and he had not been there for a few days, but he came in with Denise, and it was late at night. I was working on this, and he said, we need more signs, we need more signs. So he was punching out confetti signs, and Denise was punching them out, and Bob and I were putting them on this model, which we carried over to the Student Center the next morning for the presentation. Bob said, don't get the book, I'm going to send it to you. And he did, and such a gentleman. Dear Danny, you were great, Bob Venturi. And then over the years, I also, they were around school a lot, and Peter Papadimitriou took this picture of me and Denise with similar hairstyles, although mine is longer. Another thing that happened during this time was we had this project outside. Seems like it was outside of studio to look at a corporate graphics campaign, and I thought, Jack in the Box, not any of these corporate things, but something that's a little bit off. So I went over to Jack in the Box on Kirby, and John Casbarian had the same idea, and he arrived at the same moment to do the Jack in the Box. And this is, I think this is first year. John thinks this is second year. But this is like the first time we really kind of bonded. And there he is with his red Vespa. And of course, the rest is history. I mean, that's one of those little unintentional turning points where you don't know. So by fourth year, our class had Charles Shorey, and you can see here myself, John, in his characteristic outfit, Bob, Charles Shorey off to the right, and Jerry Moorhead, who's here tonight. And thank you, Jerry, for the studio pictures that you took, and for the other pictures later that you will have taken in a minute. And so these were the guys that we really, and the woman with the pipe in her mouth is Liliana Milani, who becomes a partner of ours at some point. So Shorey's class was called Life Class. We had him twice, and this was life class in the sense of this is life, not only to draw naked ladies, but also to ride the train in the park for an afternoon session. But the most important thing that Shorey did for me, was he encouraged us all to get cameras, get a single lens reflex camera. And I did that, and between Charles and Jeff Winningham, whose course I took the first year he taught it. I was out on the streets of Houston taking shots, being out there, and another kind of turning point for me. Jeff's class, the little book that he published from this class, says Media Center 1968 or 69, but his Media Center at St. Thomas, before the Demenils brought the Media Center abruptly to Rice. So Paul has continuing influence. At some point after Le Corbusier died, Paul goes to Paris to 35 Rue de Sèvres because he wants to see what the atelier is doing after Corbu. And he meets Guillermo Julien de la Fuente, and they start with lunch, wine at lunch, and they go for it. And Paul invites Julien to Rice. And Julien comes to Rice for 2 weeks to study the Hospital of Venice, which is the project that Corbu was working on when he died, and that he had given written instructions entrusting it to Julien. So here I am on the team, very small team, and it was basically just an investigation of the design for the hospital, which is fantastic. I mean, this is one of the most amazing late career turnarounds or advancements, breakthroughs that you can imagine. I mean, nothing like what Corbu had done before, and he really sets a new, mat buildings were being talked about, but he really pushes it completely forward with this building suspended above the water with light for the patient rooms from above. So we did this book from that study. This is an Architecture at Rice, number 23. My timer is completely off now, so I don't know how far long. This is 92 minutes, but I haven't been going that long, have I? Okay. So we published this book, Architecture at Rice, number 23, detailing the hospital at that stage. And it was actually published and sold in bookstores. And with the proceeds of this, $1,500, I was able to go to Paris on preceptorship in one of the early years of the preceptorship program. In those days, $1,500 went a lot further than it does now, but nonetheless, I was fascinated by these sketches that Corbu had done of the hospital of Venice mostly, and I think in retrospect mostly from postcards, but that's okay. So when I got to Paris in 1969, I got all the sketchbooks like Corbu used, and the rubber stamps and the stencils and the Crow-Quill pen. And Julien first sent me, he said, go to Venice first and help these students who are working on their thesis project. And I went there, and then I continued on down with a Voyage d'Orient. And I kept the sketchbooks. I carried a Crow-Quill pen and a few colored pencils. And I kept trying to find ways to apprehend these kind of new urban discoveries that I was finding in every little town. And I mean, not any kind of drawing that you would normally do, or photographs. All the hundreds of photographs I took were pretty useless. Actually, I've never even looked at them. They were total disappointment. But the sketches, I think, captured something about what I was seeing that was very, very important. So you guys who were in my class, sketching class this semester, you've seen these, but this is like the first lesson about how important that was. So I came back to Paris. We spent the winter in Paris, and in the spring, Julian set up an atelier in Venice on the site in the macello, which is the slaughterhouse, a big loft space. The other spaces in the slaughterhouse were still being actively used for slaughter, but we did architecture, and we had a little trattoria that made us lunch every day, and we had extended lunch periods with lots of wine, and then we staggered back along the Fondamenta San Giobbe. That's me on the left-hand side, and all of the other people students that Julian had brought there from Italy, Norway, Berkeley, Harvard, all the schools that he had lectured at in the last year congregated here. And this is the workspace. I don't have a very good photograph of it, but look at the details of this. This is amazing. The models of the hospital, the blackboard in the back with chalk drawings, sketches. Sometimes, I think at some point, this chalkboard had a full-size section of the hospital, of the patient rooms. I learned a lot. I came back to Houston for fifth year, and I immediately moved into Isabella Court. Very luckily, rent was $55 a month. It didn't go up too much from then. I was in this apartment right here on the corner for 13 years. This is an amazing piece of architecture designed in 1928. It's on Main Street, if you don't know it. It's got an elevated courtyard over shops with all of the apartments grouped around the courtyard, and this glass skylight that kind of superheats the air so that it evacuates because of heat effect, stack effect. So in fifth year, there were 4 of us who took on this project to look at the barrios in Houston. This was a project funded by Model Cities through the Magnolia Business Center, a local community group that wanted to do some kind of, look at the whole situation. So we looked at it for a semester. We published this book, and then Lily and I went on for a semester looking at a project along Canal Street that would take existing buildings and make by means of a simple arcade system, make a kind of civic space on an existing street. We were inspired a little bit by St. Thomas and that kind of, very simple structure. And Magnolia Business Center was interested in pursuing this, so they set us up, Lily and me, as the Barrio Project on site. Joe, same site as you're on, I think now, on Sampson Street, or close to it. This was, Macashan Street, okay, 3405, within your neighborhood. And our new friend, young Chronicle Cub reporter Tom Curtis, who we had just run across, wrote a piece about us in the Chronicle. Students find a cultural heart in a Houston barrio, and he talks about everything we were going to do. And actually, we spent 2 years working on it until he was able to write the follow-on piece, Idea That Fizzled. Because Model Cities was defunded. Jesus, it's always happened, and it still happens. Any federal project is likely to be defunded. So that was it for Lily and me on that project, but we found ourselves kicking around Houston with Bob and John, and basically they now had their master's degrees. I didn't. We were working on different projects, doing competitions, getting together for beer in the evenings, and basically just having a club. And Bob had been at I.M. Pei's office with and then had worked with Peter Eisenman to start the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. John had worked at, John's preceptorship was in LA with Victor Gruen's office on Caesar Pelli's team before he would, Caesar before he was Caesar. And then he hooked up with Craig Hodgetts at the founding of the California Institute of the Arts. So we were getting together, having a good time, talking about things, drinking beer, probably out of humdinger cups. And at one point we saw that we could maybe rent a storefront space at Taft and Fairview for $70. And we, okay, nice clubhouse. So we did. And in a short time, we had a few little jobs like building a model for somebody. And we decided to put ourselves out as Architecture Incahoots and Associates, which was a name that one of our teachers had given us. He said, you guys are just Incahoots, because he realized we were working together on things. So we called ourselves that. Bob and John made little decals and put them on all the faculty doors. I did not participate in that. We realized we couldn't call ourselves Architects Incahoots, but things were not so strict in those days. We called ourselves Architecture Incahoots, and we got away with that for some time. But fortunately, we were not building anything at that time. But then things got more serious. Lily left to pursue dreams of filmmaking. We got registered. Actually, Bob and John got registered first, and I worked for them. We changed our name from Incahoots to Taft Architects. We gathered our associates, Joyce, Mark, Mark's back there someplace, Mary, Jeff, Kirby. We all know Kirby. And we started, our practice got more and more serious. And over the next 50 years, we're still going. We've done a whole sequence of projects. This is off our website. We like to take a look at what these projects are diagrammatically. The ones on the left are the early projects, which were really well published. Magazines were very interested in what we were doing next. We were on the lecture circuit. We were teaching at different schools. We were in great demand. And then we did these projects on the right-hand side in our more mature days, which I think are much better, serious projects. And by that time, everybody had lost interest. So these projects have not been published, but they should be. I'm not going to talk about the work of Taft Architects any more than this. That's another 2 lectures, and for John and me, are a book or 2. It's a whole story. But instead, I want to, so we forgot about this one. This is while we were flying high. We were invited to go to the Chicago conference, and we hung out with Peter, Leon, Stanley, Tadao, Raphael, Rim, Michael, Frank, Caesar. That's me between Frank and Michael Graves, and John's beside me. And this was a private invited conference that we got invited to, and it was great fun to be with all of these guys. So stuff happens. Bob became dean at UH, and then USC, and then he passed away in 2005. John has been committed to Rice with the external programs, preceptorship and RSAP, for as long as I can remember, and has served twice as dean here. But the work of Taft, that's another lecture. Whoops. Instead, I'm going to go off on a tangent. Another group that I fell in with in those days was KPFT Radio. And they were asking for volunteers, and I went down and volunteered. And I first met David Crosley and Jody Blazek, who are here, who, boy, little did I realize what a big fork in the road that was. So these were radio types, writers, journalists, news people, completely different than I knew. And I was an archetype among these stereotypes, as they said, and I spent a few years with KPFT, and then David and Jody went off to the Peaceable Kingdom commune. Can I call it commune? Community. And with the idea of setting it up as a school so that people could come from Houston, take short weekend courses, and learn different rural trades. And they asked me to do a barn building. The PK had acquired surplus lumber from the Watkins Glen concert that came to Houston, and then they sold it all as surplus. So we worked out a kind of constructional system that would make use of the lumber we had. And we designed a very simple truss structure. And over 4 weekends in October, with volunteers, school people, associates, Taft Architects, Rice people. Jerry, thanks for the photographs. The best photographs here are by Jerry Moorhead. And we did our first kind of design build project. So this is all in the first 4 days of constructing it. I mean, this was, low skill levels, but this was a school, so they were learning how to do stuff. So we set up the trusses. On the 4th weekend, David and Jody got married, and it was like a big festival. But it took another year to finish building the barn for the diehards, and we continued on. And I will say that this building is still there after 50 years, more than 50 years at least. It needs a little bit of work on it, but basically in not bad condition. But that's the beginning of design build programs. While I was driving back and forth to Navasota, I kept seeing these kind of country storefronts. And I was, once I started looking at them, I kept seeing more and more of them. And I thought that would be an interesting kind of photographic project. I mean, one of my favorite photographs by Walker Evans is this Richard Perkins contractor, this little stepped storefront with a pile of gravel in front of it. And then at the same time was the Becker's book just came out, and this notion of these kind of documentation photographs that could constitute a series or a typology or a morphology. And the other topographics photographers were strong. I was very taken by those guys. The Beckers were in that book as well. So I decided to make a project out of it. And over several years, I shot hundreds of these things and finally put together a collection of 21 of them. And we had a little exhibition at Brazos Bookstore. So this is a morphology for me. It's like a sequence of shapes that all relate together somehow. A few years later, actually 10 years later, Bob and John and I got a mid-career Rome Prize. And you don't have to have a project. We just sort of made up projects as we went along. But one thing I wanted to do was do some better photography of Roman and Italian monuments, classic architecture like this, the Duomo of Firenze. And I got a bellows camera with roll film, good for traveling, pretty high resolution. But as I started traveling around, I started noticing that it wasn't the monuments in Italy that were the most interesting. It was these little kind of vernacular buildings that were just like everywhere. And every village had some kind of little church, maybe by some forgotten architect, but not, you know, these are not in the history of art books, but they are really, really interesting works of architecture. And once again, I put together a portfolio. Another aspect of this was these kind of cascine, these communal farmhouses where families would live together and farm. Usually there was a patron and all of these families living there in support. And I would always ask to get in and photograph if I could. Not to go through that sequence again. So those two collections became a single show for the first Photo Fest in, can you see when that is, 1988, which was in here, in this room, Farish Gallery, as a photo show. Incidentally, it's still in boxes. I can reconstitute it. So, once again, if any of you were in my sketch class, read this first paragraph, because it's the same thing I've been saying, you know, 50 years later about photography and versus sketching. And this was a piece that I wrote for City Magazine, which David Crosley was editing, and he pointed out to me the other day that this is his writing and my writing on this manuscript, trying to knock this article together, and these little sketches that I did, and then he titled them below. So some of this stuff just keeps coming around. So all of these days, I was very lucky to be a kind of hanger-on on the faculty. I was just a part-timer, pinch hitter, lurking around the edges, on hand if needed to assist somebody in a studio or to coordinate visiting studios. And I had a great time doing that because I was able to coordinate Michael Wilford while they were doing this extension to the building. Cedric Price, Bob and Denise were here a lot. Ed Jones, Jeremy Dixon, and others. It was just great, great fun. And I did a series of studios toward the end, but what really shifted things for me was partnering with Nonya Grenader. Then everything changed, and we were able to embark on several projects that I think were the most important of my whole teaching career, if not whole career. One was a coordinated first-year sequence for both semesters, and the other was Rice Building Workshop. So we were able to put together a kind of coordinated first-year curriculum that bridged all the way, that made an arc from basic design to architectural design and back and forth, continually relating those things together. And we've had, I think I passed my note with how many students we had, but like 500 first-year students who've been through this. And I'm really proud of some of what we were able to do there. We invented a lot of problems, and I'm just going to show you one sequence. This is some old shots of the toy problem. This was to make a constructive set of pieces that could fit together in unpredictable ways and then be packed together for carrying and with a set of instructions. And we have 20 years of these things. Every one of them is amazing. My mission right now is to document and archive all of the first-year work that we still have, including all of these things and new photographs and all of the other projects that we gave over the years. I mean, it's astounding work, and I'll be lost in that for the next year. So, hands-on, get in the shop, start cutting, start making things, start worrying about how things go together, what tolerances are, what finishes affect that, and in a larger sense, how do you structure things together so that you make larger scale, where there's a relationship of the part and the whole and the context. Some of these things are just absolutely brilliant. And great reviews out in the arcade. This was also the occasion for me to sit back and think about some of the kind of pedagogical aims and to put sketches together for chalkboard talks that would put everybody to sleep. But actually I was not me. So this was a sketch for a color lecture about how energy comes from the radiant energy comes from the sun, goes through the atmosphere, hits a leaf, for instance, knocks things out of their orbits, and then innervates, sends an image to the eyeball that then goes through the optic nerve to the brain, where the leaf image, you can't quite tell it in this sketch, is projected onto the back of the brain. Almost not quite, but almost a one-to-one mapping in the brain of the optical image. Or this one about what you see from a single eyeball view, a kind of, if I were going to do this now, I would realize that it's kind of foggy around the edges, but a vertical axis, a horizontal, a horizon, a ground plane, the air, and your nose off on the edge of the eyeball frame. And if you put those together, the nose more or less cancels out, and then you have this kind of rectangular frame, not quite rectangular, but we understand it as being within a rectangular frame of the field of vision. Or what's the difference between a plant and an animal, or between an airplane and a boat, or whatever. Some of these never made it into lectures, but, or what are all the kind of infrastructural supports for a house that are outside the next level up from the house itself. And then finally, Nonya and I were able to do the building workshop with the charge from Lars to get students out of the studio and into the larger community. Nonya was totally committed to looking at affordable housing and how do you accomplish that, and tying us into Project Row Houses from the very beginning, and then a whole series of projects looking at how is it possible, how can you achieve affordability. One lesson was make things smaller and smaller, and then, this was before the tiny house movement, before ADUs, but we realized that the shotgun house in Project Row Houses was probably, kind of minimal family living unit, and that when you accrete them together, just common, similar units accreted together, make a kind of urbanity at the next scale up that involves the street and the backyard. And that's all it really takes. So, and then at the other end of it is what things can you look at to keep things easier to construct, more affordable, and, looking, Rose, are you still here? Memories of the Plus House, a kind of core piece that goes into an ADU. So much fun to build. And then the next and final ADU, the auxiliary house. These are not at Project Row Houses, these are other places. Interior by Rose Wilkowski. And by this time, we are not building workshop, we are construct, and it's not, I'm working with Andrew Colopi, and Nonya has retired. So many memories of working on site. David, and thank you for the bellows contributions from time to time of cranes and warehousing and superintendents. There have been so many people who have helped so many different aspects of all of these things. Impossible to name them all. These two little books, I think, pretty well define the building workshop period. There's a little bit more archiving to do with this, but basically, I'm going to focus on first year. So I think it's the worst thing possible to put text up on a PowerPoint. I hate that. I hate when professors profess to talk about what design is, but you guys are a captive audience, and this is my swan song, and I offer you this definition of design that I would say, in a very general sense, applies equally to organisms, cities, information systems, and architecture, and that it slowly fades out. Thank you.